Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. In the opening pages of what is considered the founding work of history in Western literature, Herodotus tells the story of King Croesus, the late ruler of Lydia, who governed the lands of Western Anatolia in the mid-6th century BC. At the height of his reign, he was visited by Solon, the lawgiver, who had just laid the foundations for Athenian democracy. "Stranger of Athens," inquired Croesus, "we have heard much of thy wisdom and of thy travels through many lands, from love of knowledge and a wish to see the world. I am curious, therefore, to inquire of thee, whom of all the men that thou hast seen thou deemest the most happy." Croesus, expecting to hear the sound of his own name sung from Solon's lips, was angered by the Athenian's reply as he proceeded to extol the happiness of lesser men, lacking the trappings of wealth and empire that Croesus himself so readily possessed. "What, stranger of Athens, is my happiness then so utterly set at naught by thee, that thou dost not even put me on a level with private men?" In his reply, Solon uttered words that would not only haunt Croesus, but which would obsess the whole of Athenian society for centuries to come. "Μηδένα πρώτου τέλους μακάριζε." Only at the end can the weight of a life's worth be truly measured. Not long after Solon's visit, Croesus' kingdom was invaded and conquered by Cyrus the Great, ruler of the Persian Empire. Condemned to death, it is said that Croesus yelled out from the flaming pyre atop which his body burned 3 times the name of the Athenian lawgiver. It was not until that moment that he understood the message that Solon had so dutifully delivered. By then, there was nothing left of his life to salvage, only tears, charred bones, and ashes. This week on Hidden Forces, Rebecca Goldstein, philosophy, virtue, and what makes a human life worth living. Rebecca Goldstein, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Hi, it's good to be here.
I was just telling you before we began recording that I wrote the intro to this show uncharacteristically before the episode was done, and I was thinking about the ancient Greeks and how to capture this issue of ethics, and you've commented on this before. The Greeks were haunted by the specter of death and by the capricious nature of life and the fact that fairness didn't exist as a concept for the Greeks. I mean, justice existed, but this idea that that's not fair, I mean, their relationship to their gods highlighted that. Their mythology is replete with stories of tragic misfortunes that befell humans who happened to attract the ire of a god by no fault of their own. Actaeon, the hunter, who was torn to pieces by his own dogs after having been turned into a stag by Artemis, who saw him naked totally by accident. I mean, there's no fairness to that.
Yeah, especially, I mean, they're gods. You put your finger on it because, I mean, the Greek gods, they're dreadful. I mean, they're
dreadful.
They're dreadful. You know, they're greedy, they're lusty. I mean, you walk through
the worst type of person.
They really are, except they're, you know, much more powerful and they never die, basically. And so their religion was very apotropaic, warding off evil. You didn't just try to
piss them off.
Didn't want to piss them off. You didn't want to compete with them. I mean, that's always a huge mistake. Nothing good ever came from that. And you don't really want to attract too much of their attention. So what's so interesting about them is because something big was going on in not just Greece during this time, but many parts of the globe, right? In China and India and Persia and up in those Judean hills, what's called the axial age, that these normative paradigms were being forged. Hinduism and Taoism and Confucianism and the Abrahamic view and Greek philosophy. And you wonder why. I'm leaving out a bunch of other religions that I should be remembering.
We're going to leave out so much here.
Buddhism,
everything.
Yeah. But, all of the religions that speak enough to this existential question, which is, what am I doing here? Do I have any purpose? Is there any meaning? Do I matter? What can I do to make myself matter? I think all of these normative paradigms are speaking to that existential need that we have to somehow justify the seriousness with which we can't help taking our lives, right?
Yeah.
Just to pursue our lives, we've got to take them seriously. But with these extra big brains that we have, we can sort of step outside and say, really? Is it really worth it? And all of these paradigms were forged. And the Greeks, they had their awful gods, but they don't try to answer this existential question in terms of their gods. Their gods are too unreliable. They're just too... They're dicks.
They are dicks. I was thinking that
dicks.
is the exact thing I thought about.
Yeah.
I said they're dicks.
Yeah.
They were just dicks.
This is what they were. Yeah. They were like Harvey Weinstein, bigger and never dying, right? So, yeah. And I think that this was kind of the preconditions for philosophy, for this kind of secular reason way of trying to figure out how to make our lives worth something, right? I mean, Socrates' statement that the unexamined life is not worth living. This is a normative statement. This is like what you have to do in order to have a life worth living. The Judaic, or I shouldn't say Judaic, but, the Abrahamic answer, well, you are made in the image of God. You've got to live in a way that will please God. So these very different approaches. But what is so interesting about the Greeks is, I think because their gods were such dicks, they just left that out of it and went about it in a different way, or at least some proper subset of them did. I mean, I don't want to say the Greeks were all philosophers. They weren't. They killed Socrates.
They killed Socrates, which most people don't know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have heard the name Socrates. I imagine most people don't even know who Socrates is. Certainly the people in this audience do.
Yeah.
But even of those who do know who he is, few, I think, know the story.
Yeah, it's an incredible story that he was put on trial for just philosophizing in Athens, the most cultivated and intellectual of all of the city-states.
For asking questions that pissed people off, for asking questions that made people uncomfortable, that challenged the existing notions that the Athenians held so dear, and their exceptionalism. He challenged their exceptionalism.
Exactly right. And that is something they really, I call them in my last book, it was the ethos of the extraordinary. I mean, to be is to be special. Otherwise, you're nothing.
Which goes back to this question of mattering, what matters.
So I think that's the question, the driving question of the axial age, how we get all of these different normative paradigms, the Abrahamic, Confucianism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Greek philosophy. But the non-philosophical Greeks, the ones who put Socrates on trial and voted him to die, a brimming cup of hemlock he got for his efforts, you have to be extraordinary, and the way to be extraordinary is to do something big, to be remembered, glory, fame. And if you can't do it yourself, you participate in a glorious city-state, and that's what Athens was, So how dare you criticize? It's always dangerous to criticize the presumptions that make a person feel that his life is worth living. And what did he say? He said, the unexamined life is not worth living. You are not living an examined life. You are not living a life worth living.
I think Socrates, we know this through Plato, or we assume it through Plato, he had a view of existence in the world that was much more compatible with modern Judeo-Christian ideas than his contemporaries did, the Greeks of the time. Their immortality was kleos, was through virtue, was through, I had this picture I showed you here of Odysseus, where he was crying at the court of the Phaeacians when he heard the bard sing his name, and he said, I haven't been forgotten.
Yeah.
My story has lived on, even though they have thought I was dead.
That's right, exactly. His son Telemachus said, if he died in battle, that would be fine because his name would live on. But he's just gone. He disappeared. So, yeah, this is to be, yes, you said kleos, fame, glory, to be worthy of being sung by the poets, to be replicated in many, I mean, we have it in our day. Like, we're kind of post-Abrahamic religion now.
There's so many commonalities. I mean, those are the things I want to talk about.
Yeah, there's just have a large Twitter following or this or that, or, I mean, to be replicated in many minds. I think to say that you matter, which is what everybody wants to be able to say, that they matter. I mean, as long as the basics.
That it's not for nothing.
It's not for nothing. It takes so much
energy. The suffering is not for nothing.
And the longing and the fighting and the winning and the losing and that, but just it takes so much energy and concentration to pursue a human life. And it has to matter to you, or it's a condition of your pursuing it. But, you want to sort of be able to say, yeah, and it really does matter. So when you say something matters, you're saying it's worthy of attention. When somebody says, look, that doesn't matter, it means don't pay attention to it. It's just not worth thinking about. So there's a link, I think, between saying that something matters or somewhat matters and attention. And so a very natural way to validate that you matter is to be paid attention to. So, and, you see it with children. I mean, I have a grandchild, and I when he was went to visit him, and he was a month old, and he's just making this eye contact with me. He
the
wants
kids are the
to
best when they
know.
do
Oh
that.
man, that's
Oh my
amazing.
God.
He just wants to know that you can see. And then that we actually, in terms of our neurophysiology, we have neurons that are dedicated to just being able to tell when somebody's looking directly at us. A few centimeters to the side, those neurons won't fire. Other neurons will fire. So we are so attuned to who's paying attention to us.
Well, I know you spend a lot of time with chimpanzees. That's how chimpanzees, if I'm not mistaken, convey their desire to mate. Female chimpanzees, persistent staring,
That
right?
persistent staring, yeah. You know about me and my chimps. I love those chimps.
We could go down all those roads. But the thing I wanted to say is I just want to really kind of let this point sit a moment, because I want to see if we can extract more out of it, because to me it's so profound. And maybe it's because there's so much literature that exists from the Athenians and from the Greeks generally. But this, not just preoccupation, but obsession with the weight of life, the weight of suffering, and that they worked through it in their theatrical productions and in their work and in their poetry, and that someone like Socrates would challenge it so sort of brutally in that way and make a mockery of some of those things. When I was younger, I didn't appreciate, because I was coming from a Western Judeo-Christian perspective. And I told you before in an email exchange that for me, Socrates' approach was a godsend. It was like, this is it. I found a way to make sense of the world, to reason my way to immortality, because I had so much and still do have death anxiety. Nothing crazy, not a Woody Allen situation, but just I think an acknowledged level of anxiety around death, which we don't acknowledge in today's society. And it's interesting to think about what impact the Christian ideas and conceptions of the afterlife, because their approach is, don't worry about it, just believe and don't worry about it, whereas the Greeks worried about it. They dealt with it, and it was a difficult burden that they carried around. And just thinking of it that way and understanding that Socrates, his proddings, his questions were no joke. They really struck at the heart of what these Athenians were dealing with inside.
That's right. Yeah. No, it's interesting that they couldn't really find a way of consoling themselves. Their afterlife sucks, right?
Horrific.
That's right. When Odysseus, speaking of Odysseus, when he goes down, and then when he sees Achilles, and then he goes down to Hades, he has to get some instructions how to get home from down there, and he meets Achilles. Oh, Achilles, you are the most honored among all mortals, up above. You must be having a grand old time in Hades. And Achilles said, I would rather be a slave. I would rather be, the slave of the most miserable taskmaster than to be dead.
I remember that.
Yeah. So they don't think the universe is fair. They don't think the gods are fair. They don't think the afterlife is fair. And all we have is this human life and the only kind of immortality we can have that will show us that we were something rather than nothing is to be glorious, and to have people know of us, so it won't be as if we never lived at all.
I thought you were going to say Agamemnon or his mother, and you said Achilles, and you know what? That just really highlights it, because Achilles was the prototypical hero. Right. He died young on his shield, and when he was dead, he regretted it.
Yes.
And that is the conflict. It just highlights the fragility, how fragile the peace that the Greeks had with death was.
That's right. And then there's this moment in the Iliad, because Achilles, even Socrates in the Apology praises Achilles. And if you think about it, it's just a pouting, he gets his girl taken away as booty, so he pouts in his tent for, like a teenager who had the car taken away from him, and he lets all his comrades die. He's the greatest warrior, but he doesn't come to save them, and finally he does. But the reason, why is he praised so much? Why does Socrates even praise him? And here you really get to what I call this ethos of the extraordinary. He says at one point, mother told me, his mother, like all the Greek heroes, Achilles comes from a metaphysically mixed parentage, a mortal. One parent is mortal and one is immortal. So his mother is a goddess. So, my mother tells me, Thetis was her name, that two choices await me. If I can live a short but extraordinary life, or a long but ordinary life. And he chooses the short but extraordinary life. And because it's extraordinary, he sung, right? The Iliad, the alternative name for the Iliad is Song of Achilles. It's all about Achilles. The first line, sing, O muses, of Achilles, of the rage of Achilles, right? So there you have it. The reason he's the poster child, the best of all Achaeans, they say, is because he chose the short but extraordinary life. He was given the choice. And therefore he's song-worthy. We can sing of him. And what Socrates says to them is, you do have to be extraordinary. But just getting lots of attention, that's not going to do it. In fact, that's not really important at all. You have to be extraordinary by pursuing wisdom and justice. And even if people don't recognize you for this, even if they condemn you to death and serve you hemlock, that's a worthwhile life. So it's the cultivation of not kleos, not this external glory, but arete, virtue, sort of excellence, the thing, which can be very private and unacknowledged and unapplauded. So that's the lesson of Socrates.
Well, interestingly enough, I told you also, again, to bring it back to the introduction, which I wrote after I finished this rundown, and it's not even part of my original questions. The men that Solon gives to Croesus were not famous men. They were men that had families, lived a long time, and died valiantly in battle.
Yeah. So,
they weren't heroes.
That's true. Although dying valiantly in battle
carry some level of
carried
virtue.
A lot of
for sure.
It really did.
For sure. But they weren't kings, or they weren't.
That's right. Any kind of
mythologized.
It's true, but any kind of extraordinary we do, even extreme beauty. So Helen, she's living a worthwhile life according to this pre-Socratic notion, because everybody knows her story, right? She also inspires the Iliad. There would be no Iliad without Helen. So to be a great warrior in any way that you can attract attention. Now this, I think, there are such parallels with our society. The great longing for celebrity, that people have, and that
narcissism.
Well, I would say I'm more sympathetic towards it because we all want to matter. And to attract attention, for people to know you exist, makes you feel like you matter. And it's funny because I was never on any kind of social media at all. And then for the last book...
Well, you have the mainstream media, Dr. Goldstein. You've been around.
But I've certainly been around for a long time.
You've had the mainstream media cover you.
But for my last book, my publicist and agent said, you have to do something. Facebook, Twitter, something. And then I was like, Twitter, I don't know. Because sort of...
Plato at the Googleplex.
So that's... Yeah, well, so then I said, okay, I'll tweet as Plato. So it's Plato on book tour. That's my shtick there. And for a while, I watched... my followers mounting, I would get like an endorphin kind of,
And you compared yourself to other people, obviously. You compared yourself to other prominent people in your field and said how many followers they have.
I did. Or like my far more popular husband, like just wiped me out, right? And I thought, this is fascinating. Like we are so wired. And it was like a biological reaction to it, which I just found it's data. It's interesting.
How many does Stephen have? When's the last time you checked? Your husband is Stephen Pinker, for those who don't know.
So, I don't know. There are people who have more. I don't know. I don't compare anymore.
You're right. So fascinating. So, we could spend even more time just talking about the Greeks, and we hardly touched on philosophy, and hopefully we'll...
Well, this is, in a way, it's philosophy. Yeah. Everything's philosophy, really.
But what is philosophy?
What is philosophy?
I've got you here, got you on the hot seat.
Yeah.
What is philosophy?
So as you know, I'm very, very interested in math and in science. And at first I thought that's what I was going to go into. And I still try to keep up with all of that. I think to be
pure mathematics? You were studying that?
Yes, and physics. For the kind of philosopher I want to be, it's just important for me to keep up with science. Anyway, I love it. But what I think of philosophy is a way of trying to get the biggest picture of everything. And that's why I think it's very important to know science, because science is part of the picture, our view of the world and of ourselves in the world, which is basically what we want. A view of, where are we and what are we and what are we supposed to be doing with what we are for the short period of time that we have. Science is part of the answer to that. Where are we? What is this world like? And what are we? Are we part of this physical nature? We have to know the science to be able to answer that. But then what do we make out of all of these other questions that we have? Trying to reconcile all of the information that we have. Which intuitions can we keep? Which have to go? So the question that first started me, this question of what kind of universe am I living in? Is it a universe in which morality makes sense? If there's a God who allows innocent children to be killed, can that be a universe that makes moral sense? So that original question that bothered me so much as a child, I think that's a prototypical, that's already philosophical reasoning. Here's some information I have. Bad people do terrible things to innocent children, right? The most defenseless people in the world. And what kind of universe am I living in, given that that's the case? And what has to go? Because I can't reconcile everything that I think. I think that's a typical kind of philosophical move. That's what Socrates was doing. He was drawing people out. Here, you believe A, B, C. Well, look, I can derive a contradiction. One of those things has to go. That's the work of philosophy.
Well, let me take a quote from a philosopher who you know very well. Her name is Rebecca Goldstein. This is from Plato at the Googleplex.
Very unreliable source.
I mentioned to you, I've read the book top to bottom. I actually heard it on audiobook. I loved it. What a great job you did. You must have paid out of the nose for that narrator. He was excellent.
Audiobooks just does that, but I got to choose. So I listened to...
He was excellent.
I thought so too.
Because he did voices. So let me take this quote. It's a bit long, but I think it's valuable because it expresses, I think, what you're trying to say there. Philosophers asking and asking without ever possessing the means of answering sometimes ask questions that are, so to speak, proto-scientific, posed before the science yet exists that can pursue them effectively, which is to say empirically. But even though it's the philosophers who ask the questions, it's always the scientists who answer them. Philosophy's role in the whole matter is to send up a signal reading, "Science desperately needed here," or, changing the metaphor, philosophy is a cold storage room in which questions are shelved until the sciences get around to handling them. Or, to change the metaphor yet again, philosophers are premature ejaculators who pose questions too embarrassingly soon, spilling their seminal genius to no effect.
Oh, boy.
An endorsement for your book. It's funny. It's not just scientific or philosophical. But I love that, and you've used that before, this idea that philosophy is almost like the mind shining its light onto the world, and then the tools of the world are what science is. But philosophy is before that. It's proto-scientific, as you say.
It is, but it also, even when science gives us the answers about certain things, there's still this work for philosophers that I don't think that when science gets through, if it ever gets through, with all of what it asks and we get the answers to them, there won't be room left for philosophers to do their work. That some of the questions that philosophers ask are proto-scientific. But there's this other job that philosophy does, which is to try to reconcile. We're very compartmentalized creatures, which makes us very self-contradictory creatures. And, that we're able to hold inconsistent thoughts in our head, especially morally inconsistent thoughts in our head. And it's philosophy's task to destroy that happiness of our living with our inconsistencies.
That's another great point you've made before, which is to upset the apple cart in a sense. Which is exactly what Socrates did, of course, right? Exactly.
But
are there questions that science will never be able to answer?
Yeah.
Because ultimately the empirical universe comes before us, or we come before it. The deeply existential questions, how can they be answered when we're the ones viewing the world? We can't experience our existence from an objective place. We're subjective experiences.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's very, very important. I think that certain of the answers that philosophers can establish is to take certain presumptions that we have to have just in order to pursue our lives. For example, that I matter, right? that at least I matter to myself, right? That you can't pursue your life. You wouldn't get up in the morning.
It's so depressing. Have you ever entertained the possibility that your life is irrelevant and you don't matter?
Of course. I mean, how could you not, And that the worst thing, I think the thing that hurts the most is look, other people have managed to matter, but not me.
Yeah, that's what makes it worse.
That's kind of clinical depression is what that is. And its website for the prevention of suicide is called You Matter. I mean, that's how fundamental it is to our mental health, to just feel as if we matter at least as much as other people. And okay, so if that's a presumption for just leading a healthy life, what other things follow from that? Now, I think that the whole force of moral philosophy, starting with the Greeks and going through Spinoza and Hume and Kant and Tom Nagel's The Possibility of Altruism and John Rawls, that the whole court, and none of these people brought in the Abrahamic God, it was all this process of trying to reason it out. The whole course of moral philosophy has left us has demonstrated the truth of this. I have to presume my own mattering, and I do. I mean, just to get on with my life. I can't presume I matter any more than any other person in the world. That there's no way that I matter more than anybody else. Wherever there's human life, there's mattering. And that's kind of the basis of ethics, isn't it? I mean, all of the moral progress we've made has been recognizing, that it doesn't matter that I'm this race rather than that race, or, I was born into this nationality rather than that one, or that I'm male or female, or, that's what moral progress has been, to realize to the extent that we're going to claim mattering for ourselves, we're just going to have to universalize it to at least all humans, I would say even beyond.
So what you're saying is that in order to build this foundation of moral philosophy, of morality, we have to presume that we matter. But is it possible to have the experience to know that you matter? Have you ever had a subjective experience where religion would call it revelation?
Yeah.
And I think Spinoza, again, I've never read Spinoza directly, but indirectly I've gotten hints of this, that for him, it seemed that God played a limited role insofar as he wasn't part of all the complicated. He didn't make, like you said, he didn't make decisions to intervene, but at a fundamental level, he believed in this idea of revelation, this idea that truth can be revealed to you.
Through reason, right?
Everything is through reason.
Everything, and he uses the Euclidean methodology, start with definitions,
including mattering?
Well, he doesn't use that language, mattering. That's my own. But yes, including ethics. I mean, his magnum opus is called The Ethics, and it's derived from, in some sense, what I would call mattering. It's this notion he has of konitas. It's in Proposition 7 of Part 3 of the Ethics, that the essence of each thing is the striving to persist and to flourish. That's what makes
That's Darwinism, basically, right?
It kind of is. It's proto-Darwinism. I think it's just incredibly prescient also in the light of the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy is increasing. Everything goes towards chaos, towards randomness. So an individual thing, including a complicated thing like us, just in order to resist entropy, has got to be striving. You know, so many things are trying to unravel us, undo us, and entropy will get us in the end. You know, we will die and we will disintegrate. Woody Allen. And Woody
the
Allen,
universe is expanding.
He hovers over all these conversations. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, a thing just in order to persist in its own being and to flourish, it's got to matter to itself.
I mentioned to you before in email exchanges about my encounter with death. And in that situation, for those in the audience who don't know, that I had a brain tumor and I went through surgery and radiation. And before the surgery, before a certain point, in particular, the radiation was for me sort of revelatory. That was a period where I experienced much more than just a subjective sense of mattering. I experienced certain things. I could only just say things that I all of a sudden knew that I had never learned. And it was a unique experience, unlike anything that I'd ever experienced before. There wasn't someone whispering in my ear. It wasn't in any way literal.
Yeah.
But I didn't need to convince myself that I mattered. All of a sudden, I knew I mattered, but I knew other things that went beyond that.
Yeah.
And that, to me, was also revelatory insofar as how I viewed the role of science. And I think I have a more instrumentalist view of science. And bringing it back to that point, I don't know, and you mentioned Sam Harris before, I think before we started the microphones, Sam seems to feel that science can answer all the questions of existence. And I feel like that is presumptuous in a sense, because it assumes that it takes away the fact that ultimately all of science comes from this subjective experience, and we don't know where we are or when we are or anything. I mean, we can't say anything definitively at the core, right, about the nature of our existence.
I am a scientific realist. I think that science tells us about the nature of matter and energy and space-time and general theory of relativity. I almost said general theory of revelation. To me, it is like a revelation. It's just such a beautiful theory. And it's so surprising, and it's kind of amazing that we evolved apes could so overturn our folk physics, you know, and come up with something like this. So I do feel like it goes some way towards telling us what the world is like and where we are. But it doesn't go the whole way. It certainly doesn't go the whole way with the sorts of existential questions that you're concerned with, I'm concerned with, and that inspired all of these great normative paradigms. Well, some greater than others. Right?
But the allegory of the cave, right? Or the Truman Show or the Matrix. How do we know if we're not in the cave, if we're in the cave or not? Can we fundamentally know that? You
know, there's always a doubt, right? And so, I mean, for me, the wonderful thing about science that we landed on this thing, and there's no such thing as a scientific method. I mean, there's no like paint by numbers thing, you know, and there are so many different kinds of scientists. But it's a kind of show of humility, of the kind of humility that you're referencing right now, which is that it has to be tested, which is a way of saying, listen, reality, tell us if we're right or wrong. And so it seems so obvious to us that simultaneity is absolute, you know. But, you know, what relativity theory did was say, okay, tell us reality. Are we right or wrong about this intuition? And reality said, you were wrong. The world is stranger than you think it is. Quantum mechanics does this with causality and with identity. And so the fact that it sort of brings reality into it and says, you know, give us a kick if we're wrong. This is a good thing. This is the way, you know, we've made some progress. Can it answer everything? No.
But what I mean is if you're Neo in the Matrix, if you're in the Matrix, if you're in the simulation, the science works. It works impeccably, and it will tell you if you're right or wrong along the rules of the simulation, the rules of the computer, the rules of the system. You don't fundamentally know if you're in a simulation or not.
Yeah.
That's just one metaphor, but you could erect many metaphors.
It could very well be, but, you know, we sort of look for the simplest story here, and the simplest story seems to be
Occam's razor.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you're absolutely right. There are all of these auxiliary presuppositions that we have to use here. We have to, in order for science to work at all, we have to presume that nature is fundamentally law-like, right? That it works according to law, so that when there's an anomaly, when there's the black body radiation or the photoelectric effect or all these things that cause revolutions, quantum mechanic revolution in the early 20th century, we don't say, oh, well, maybe it was a miracle. Maybe God just entered in and he's just messing with us. We say, oh, no, back to the drawing boards. Let's find the law of nature that will cover this.
I feel like those explanations where they bring God into the equation, I think that the problem there is that God becomes this material. He enters into this material world. And that doesn't make sense. I guess my point is that I had what you could call a mystical experience. Now that could be a complete just hallucination.
Right.
But when you have something like that, it becomes difficult. And I've had similar conversations with people that have done psychedelics. It's just one of those things where you realize that you really don't know anything for certain, that the things you thought you knew for sure, you don't actually know. They're contingent upon. And I had, from my experience, dementia, where I couldn't tell you who the president was. I couldn't tell you my birthday. I couldn't remember someone after 5 seconds. I had interrogated amnesia. So it challenged a lot of my notions of what was real or not.
Yeah.
And that's why I bring that up. But you mentioned something when you were talking about the theory of relativity, and you danced around it, and which is this, I'll pull the quote from Eugene Wigner's paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and the Natural Sciences, this relationship between mathematics, which can tell us things a priori about the world, that then when we test them empirically, they turn out to be true. Yeah. And the theory of relativity is a great example of that.
It's an amazing thing, that mathematics is, which is so beautiful.
How does that work?
We're lucky. I don't know.
Well, a lot of people were Bertrand Russell was taken by it.
It's an interesting thing, and it's really was the intuition that got modern physics off the ground, because, the Aristotelian view of trying to explain things in a very natural way, a kind of narrative way. Well, the way we explain human actions, that they're goal-oriented, teleological, right? And that's, how Aristotle explained physical motions, and that was physics for a very long time, and it got nowhere. It just got nowhere, right? And then, Galileo, who I think he should get tons of credit, right? We concentrate so much on Newton, who's magnificent, but Galileo, because he comes up with this methodology of wedding together these two unlikely partners: observation, prediction, the empirical stuff, and mathematics. The nature is written in the language of mathematics. He who wishes to peruse this great book must learn the language. That's from Galileo. And interestingly enough, so I have this whole view about Plato. I only became interested in Plato late in my life, really.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't do any of that.
That's interesting, because you have such a deep affection for him.
Interesting. I mean, I do and I don't. I mean,
well, you wrote a bunch of dialogues where you...
Well, I tried to bring out the best. I tried to,
Your best one, by the way, I'm sorry, let me just tell this to the audience. You had two that I liked a lot. One was, I told you, with the one with the Austrian child sort of therapist, obnoxious person. But my favorite one was the first one with the sort of ditzy book agent. Yeah. And I just love the things you're like, I don't know, I was in Greece, but we didn't have, it wasn't like this.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
Anyway, you really get into it.
Yeah. So one of the things I was trying to do is one, go back and try to answer the question, why did the Greeks invent philosophy? Why was that their response, or at least the response of some of them, to the great existential question of the axial age? But then, as a way of trying to show that these questions are still so much with us, and that the kind of reasoning that Plato employed, not his answers, because we've made progress. I mean, philosophy would be a poor field if Plato got everything right. Then what's the good of the rest of us philosophers, right? I mean, that would be a shoddy show for philosophy. He got a lot of stuff wrong. But this kind of reasoning, which is self-critical reasoning, so it can be turned against itself, can be turned against Plato, I want to show that it was still very relevant to the kind of questions that interest us. So, the first place I take him to is the Googleplex, the headquarters of Google.
Fantastic.
He gets into this dialogue with a software engineer as to whether you could make a crowdsourcing search engine that would be able to answer all ethical questions.
And what is true? What is true?
And what is true? And what is knowledge? And, what is it to have a justified belief? What does it take to be justified? And then one of the ways of trying to show that we've kind of made progress is that this media escort, who's not the most cultured person in the world.
I know women like that. I mean, you wrote her perfectly. You wrote her perfectly.
But she says things that kind of blow Plato away, because the kind of progress that philosophers, by way of arguing, have tortuous, with hard labor have made, filter into the culture. And so when people, like some of my best scientific friends, say to me, what have philosophers ever done?
Lawrence Krauss.
Well, him and others, yes. What a philosopher. It's so seeped into our both epistemology and our ethics and our politics too. I mean, sort of the founders of this country, they studied Plato. They were all, in their day, to be educated was to study the classics. And one of the things they were trying to do was to meet Plato's very stiff criticisms against democracy. And, so many of the safeguards that they thought they were putting in, like the Electoral College and all of these things, right, were because they had read Plato's arguments against
remarkable.
Mob rule. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting.
And they lived through the French Revolution.
Yes.
Which scared the shit out of the founders.
Yeah. Actually, they didn't, because,
well, it was right afterwards.
Yeah,
but
1789 was, the French Revolution.
Sure.
But Burke, for example, the political philosopher Edmund Burke, had witnessed the French Revolution, and, it's he is a founder of sort of modern conservative thinking, having witnessed that. So that question that's so fundamental in Plato, how do we create a society that's really just, that's going to do justice to all, given that people have very different talents and he had a quite low opinion of most people's capacity for reason. Mm-hmm. And he worried about the tyrant and the demagogue who can sway the people by emotions. Once again, there are a lot of parallels to
so
our
many,
society.
and also
it can drive you nuts.
And he
really
lived through that. The Peloponnesian War destroyed Athens.
Exactly.
It destroyed Athens, and it brought in the tyrants. It brought in the oligarchs. It brought in the 13.
Right, and one of whom was Plato's uncle, Critias. And then the restored democracy are the ones who put Socrates on trial. Mm-hmm. So, it was a living problem before him. How do we make sure that the people who rule deserve to rule and they won't exploit their power? This is a problem we're still dealing with.
You have in the appendix the 2 speeches of Pericles.
Yes.
You have the first one that he orates, I think, right before the start of the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, or is that I can't remember. Was it I know I have the funeral oration.
I don't.
After the first.
You may also have the funeral oration, but what I believe you had actually was Pericles died a little bit more than a year into the war.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah.
I believe what you had was his speech right before the beginning of the war, right at the beginning, when all was glorious.
Yeah.
And they were all congratulating themselves and patting themselves on the back and how amazing and exceptional they were.
Yeah.
And that came easily. And then the second speech was him a little further into the war when the plague had struck. He had not yet gotten sick, or maybe he had already become a little sick.
Yeah.
And he was basically scolding the Athenians, and then you could see how he transformed his language to go from scolding to basically finding a way to capture that greatness for himself and for the city, and then try to elevate oratory. He was a great orator.
He was a great orator.
And that made me think, not that George Bush was a great orator, but it made me think the arguments that he put forward for the war at the time, I think there were more parallels for that particular aspect of the Peloponnesian War in that period in Athenian history. I think there were many more parallels for the United States in the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I think that would be the beginning of the Peloponnesian War for us, if I were to draw a parallel. And I think we're sort of in it if historians were going to look back.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We certainly don't have a Pericles to...
No, we don't have a Pericles.
Yeah, we will see. I mean, one of the things that he warns against is oratory, the demagogue with the silver tongue, and the other thing that he warns against is money in politics. And he also interesting, when he's in the Republic, when he's talking about, first he lays out what he thinks is the perfectly just Plato, the perfectly just city, and then how it will deteriorate and how it will go from what he calls a true aristocracy, from the word arete, from excellence, from virtue, with the people who
rule by the good,
by the
best,
right? Philosopher kings and queens, right?
not in Athens.
Not in Athens.
You're barking up the wrong tree.
But he did accept some women to his academy, and it would take us many millennia more before women were once again accepted to higher institutes of
revolutionary
learning.
for the time.
Oh man, yes.
The Greeks were scared shitless of women. I mean, it came across in so much of their work. I mean, Lysistrata is a great example as a comedy, but the famous scene of Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon in the tub, and that scene of her coming out full of blood, soaking in blood. Yeah. I mean, that was terrifying. It must have been terrifying for those Athenians to see that.
Yeah, and Medea. I mean, what's interesting, and scholars ponder this, is they have such powerful female figures in their drama, right? And in fact, in their society, the women were kept, especially if you were upper class, you were kept in the back of the house and you couldn't go out, and they did not partake in the great civilization at all.
The two saddest days for a mother are the day her daughter dies or the day she's married, because she got married off, and if she didn't live right next door, they would move her somewhere she'd never see her again, because they couldn't talk about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I don't know what the answer is, but maybe what you're saying is like a kind of fear of the
female empowerment. There was clearly a fear of that.
Yeah. But interesting, Plato, you see sort of the power of rethinking all the assumptions of one society. He kind of argues for the equality of women. He says that there are differences in strength, right? Upper body strength, but that he doesn't see it as differences in intelligence. And for Plato, the only thing that really matters is intelligence. He did, reputedly, I like to believe it's true, accept 2 women into his academy. I like to think that's true, and there are reports of that. I think we even know their names. I can't recall now.
Well, you do seem to like him in the way you depict him.
Oh, I was going to say something about that.
Yeah.
So, when I was creating him for these dialogues, so it's really audacity, right?
Right. That's what I was thinking.
Right?
I was like, wow.
And when I got the idea,
got a lot of guts.
I thought, where do you get off, Rebecca? Where do you get off doing this? And, I thought a lot about how I wanted him to be. And so the way I created him as a character was I gave him what I take to be the best qualities of philosophy. I don't say he had these. I think he was an elitist and a prig and a Puritan and all these things. He was, right?
Slave owner.
Yeah, the Greeks never questioned slavery. So much for the Greeks knowing everything. They never questioned slavery. So I sort of make him really open-minded, willing to learn from the media escort, right? Like that. He could have his mind blown. Playful, but with an air of tragedy about him too, because life is tragic. You have to take it seriously, right? This is our one chance. You have to take it seriously. You have to take suffering seriously. And endlessly curious. He gets a computer and he's registering for MOOCs, and he learns neuroscience and everything. Because I think that's this philosophical spirit. You want to know everything.
You want to know. You want to learn.
You want to know. You want to learn. And then you want to put it all together. And that's what you're trying to do in philosophy. And it's an endless... And the more scientists tell you, the more there is to try to put it together with other things. And so it's an endless task. And that he was also really capable of love. Maybe not love. He really loved Socrates. He loved. I think that's one thing we know about Plato. He loved Socrates.
It's moving. When you realize that he dedicated his life's work to his teacher.
Yeah.
It's moving.
It is moving. It really is. And, you see him making progress in his philosophical thinking. He tries out ideas. He criticizes them. I think he even gets rid of the theory of forms post-Parmenides, the dialogue of Parmenides, where he severely criticizes his own theory of forms. And then in the later ones, it's more math that takes the place rather than forms. That's my interpretation. But he takes Socrates along on his long philosophical journey. He lived till about 81 or 82, and he was philosophizing till the end. He didn't finish the Laws, his last book. Plato, this is, as if, he wants Socrates to be part of this, and he gives Socrates always the best lines. And, that's love. That's love.
How much do you think of that was born not just out of the whole experience of Socrates, but those final days, the way he met his death, his willingness to drink the hemlock rather than recant his ideas?
Yeah, no, I do. I think it's almost like the crucifixion, the secular version
Very
of the
much
crucifixion,
so.
right?
Very much so.
A good person dying for something beyond himself, right? For something that if you've got some project that gives your life meaning and makes your life worth pursuing, it can be that project demands you end your life. Right? As contradictory as that seems, and we find that very moving. So,
it's interesting, and I wonder why that is. I mean, because it says that there's something more important than your physical existence.
Yeah.
Which speaks again to mattering.
Exactly.
If I am to really matter, then it's got to be more than just this life.
Yeah. Now, wasn't it? Martin Luther King said something like, "A man who doesn't know what he would die for doesn't know what he's living for," or something. He probably said it better. He's a wonderful orator.
He was a wonderful orator.
Yeah,
he was something else. I mean, he has, of course, that speech where he talks about he's seen the promised land. He doesn't know if he'll get there.
That's right.
But the fact that he had said that, he was basically saying, I know that I may very well die. I may be assassinated.
Yes.
But I know that you will get there. And that has meaning. That matters.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that one of the ways that we try to make ourselves matter, the most expansive way that we can, is that we're not just thinking about our own lives, but we're thinking about the lives of others and the lives of others who will come, and in some way to make it easier. But it all comes from, to really know deep in your heart that with that same passion that you can't help feeling that you matter. Everybody feels that. Everybody does. And so whatever it is that makes you matter, they've all got it too.
I want to ask you, but I'm going to throw it out there so I don't forget. I want to ask about this idea. We talked about it earlier, depression and meaning, and how undiagnosed perhaps this is as a cause for depression, cause for things like the opioid crisis. Yeah. But you mentioned something, and I don't want to forget this. You mentioned that scene, the very first dialogue in Plato at the Googleplex, where he's at the Googleplex.
Yeah.
And the engineer sort of hubristically says that, we don't need philosophy. We don't need to put in all this hard work to learn the truth. We can do it with ease. We have this search engine, and we have all these. It's, one of the things I thought about our audience, we've done a lot of shows on finance. Financial engineering takes, let's say, shitty assets, and it transforms them into AAA. Right? That's what happened created so much of the risk in the mortgage market. What your engineer said was effectively that. We're going to crowdsource all these answers of people who may know nothing.
Right.
And all of a sudden, now we have the truth. And Plato's response was, how can that be? How can the truth emerge from truthless answers?
That's right.
Something like that.
That's right. Yeah, and just how you're going to weight these different things. You're going to have to feed in some normative propositions just to know how to weight this, whose opinion to give more weight to. So what if somebody, has a certain view, but they're living a really bad life? Everybody thinks they're living a really bad life. Should we weight them as strongly as somebody who everybody admires? And just in knowing, in the same way that the Google search engine weights certain, it's not everything is equal. That right, there's some algorithm, some complicated algorithm for weighting these different things. One would have to do it.
Who guards the guardians.
Exactly.
Right? Somewhere there needs to be a philosopher. That would be Plato's argument,
that
right?
Would be his argument.
Someone needs to be in that position.
Yeah. And to do that, we're not going to get that out of the search engine, because in order to program the search engine, we first have to have the answers, right? So this circularity that you run into. One of the things that science can't answer for ourselves, talking about things that science is, what does science do? Does it discover reality, or is it an instrument for predictions, right? And scientists disagree about that, and they can all agree on the science. I spent a lot of time among physicists arguing about what does quantum mechanics mean. They all use quantum mechanics. It's the best theory we have at the moment, right, for making these predictions. But they have radically different views as to what it's telling us about reality. There's a many worlds interpretation. There's no world at all until we make a measurement interpretation. There's the Bohemian, spooky action at a distance. Anyway, so the scientific theory can't interpret itself. That's a philosophical question. So, and that's where philosophy is always coming in, which is why I think it's important for philosophers to know science. Not all philosophers. I mean, there are all sorts of philosophical questions. But in general, I think it's good.
This also leads to something else. It illuminates something that was also on my mind. And we've done a show with this very specifically with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
I haven't read it yet.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. It's very good. And you may be familiar with some of those stories like the Christakises in Yale or Brett Weinstein.
Yeah, the Christakises are good friends of ours. And yes, we lived through that with them.
Yes, I mean, remarkable. And this idea that somehow there is this moral code and that we all must know it, and that if you transgress it, in other words, that it assaults the idea that we should be able to vet ideas in the public sphere, regardless of how bad they are, that ideas are dangerous. And I think this is dangerous. If there were ever an idea that was dangerous, it is the idea that there is certain type of speech, and we're not talking about don't yell fire in a crowded theater, but that ideas can be dangerous. I mean, what a notion. Yeah.
Well, there are some ideas that are dangerous, but it's important to discuss them. I mean, if there are ideas that people have and people act on ideas.
Well, the Nazis had a lot of dangerous ideas.
They had ideas, and they were really dangerous ideas.
And they turned out to be implemented.
Exactly. But the way we attack dangerous ideas is to have people who believe them defend them, and then people who don't go after them and argue it out. I mean, that's philosophy. And that is the purpose of the university, right? That is really the purpose of the university. And so the idea that certain ideas just can't be put on the table, it is very dangerous. And it's just, so I guess my religious past had a huge effect on me. I mean, both positively and negatively. But one of the things when I did not want to rebel against my religion. I really didn't, because I loved my family. I knew it was going to hurt them. They had suffered from the evil of the world. I didn't want to cause any more suffering. But one of the things that convinced me, oh man, this is just not worth trying to wrap my head around is I wasn't allowed to question it in my school. Just don't go there. You can't go there. It's taboo. And I thought, if it's a good idea, tell me why it's a good idea. Go after my criticism.
Intuitively you had that sense.
Yeah. And I just, that was like the final straw. It's like, oh, this must be so fragile that we're not even allowed to question it. And that's just been my attitude about ideas ever since. Yeah, there are bad ideas, there are good ideas. All of them should be on the table.
I want to ask you one more question in regards to how this relates to today. We just talked about this one thing, which I think touches on these ideas of political correctness and philosophy and debate. And it's really a question of how do we discover the good, what is moral. But there's also the question of what is true. What is true? We're not even going to try to go down to figure out, what is truth. But there's actually this great quote. I don't know that it was in your book, or maybe I just remembered it and I pulled it up. It's Demosthenes. And he says, in a political system based on speeches, how can it be safely administered if the speeches are not true? Now that is, if something is not relevant to today, this world where there is indeed an assault on truth, but in some sense, I think what it does is it exposes that so many of our truths have been arbitrary, that most people don't know why they believe something.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really true. So many of our so-called truths, right? I think the thing that's happened is really interesting, that something that's become so important, I think in many parts of the world, but certainly in American politics, you're on a team. You're on a certain team. You're a conservative or you're a progressive. You're right or you're left. You're Republican or you're Democrat. And you believe everything that your team
so disgusting.
believes,
I can't
right?
Deal with that.
Your team. And sometimes, so here's the interesting thing. If there's a lot of empirical evidence for something, but your team doesn't believe in it. That shows how loyal you are to your team, and like, it's like believing Jesus walked on water, right? And, it's in the face of all the evidence. That just shows you how strong and how loyal you are. And that's taken the place of trying to actually, examine the evidence and look at it. And we can't examine the evidence for everything. Sometimes we have to depend on experts. But this has taken the place on both the right and on the left.
Oh, definitely on the left. Today, it's more prevalent on the left. I find it much more prevalent. I was thinking about this recently. Under the Bush administration, you had that with the lapel pins and patriotism. I mean, if you didn't say, like, oh, I support the troops, I support the war, you weren't a Republican, you weren't a patriot. And today you have these, in the moral sphere, this idea of you have to be on the bandwagon with this idea of white male privilege. And that as a white man, I have no place in the conversation of social issues because I'm totally biased by the fact that I'm white and my privilege and everything else. If you take issue with some of these ideas, well, then you're not a real progressive. You're not a real liberal. But it's interesting that today it's okay to be pro-war as a progressive. It wasn't 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So these values change.
Yeah, and climate change, man-made climate change.
Yeah, it's another good example.
On the other,
it's a political issue.
Yeah, and that used to be actually a conservative issue, actually. And, some people said that Al Gore did more harm to the environmental issue by making an inconvenient truth because he then made it a progressive lefty issue. And so now it's that team.
Was it first the Nixon Ford administrations that put forward any kind of, I think it was... I think it was Nixon that created the EPA.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What an act of big government. The Environmental Protection Agency.
Anyway, so it's such laziness. Instead of thinking out each issue for itself, and looking what the evidence is, see what your team is doing. And I would say, it's both sides.
And there are major problems. Just for listeners, there are major problems with the EPA and with government regulations. Governments over-regulate, but then they also regulate in ways that are beneficial to companies. So, there's problems with regulation, but I don't believe in just taking a just sort of like sledgehammer approach or whatever, a machete approach. I actually said this was the last thing, the truth thing, but I mentioned depression, and I wanted to ask you about that before we leave. How much of a role does this play, in your view, this existential need to matter?
Oh, yeah. I think, absolutely. I just saw today in front page, I think it was the Times or the Washington Post, can't remember which, or maybe the Wall Street Journal, that opioid use and suicide are really on the incline. And Suicide.
Wow.
Now, what is that about? And there is, look, I'm an atheist. I'm sort of, involved with free thinking and all of that. But there's one thing that religion really did. I mean, it made you feel like you mattered in the universe. You were created by the big one, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and he was watching you, and which is terrifying, but it also made you feel like you mattered, right? And with the decline of that, I mean, what have we replaced it with? The love of money, the love of fame? That's not open to most people. What's left with them? Disintegration of family and
disintegration of country.
And community, and you don't feel a part of much of anything, really. And so this is a social justice issue. This is something that we really ought to, because there are people who are really suffering. And I think especially for people like me who think, oh, well, religion is false and people shouldn't be duped by this. Well, then we bloody hell ought to give them something else to make them feel like they matter.
I never thought of it this way. You made me think about this in terms of exclusion versus inclusion.
Oh, man.
I never thought of it that way before.
Thing. I mean, remember what it was like in junior high? There were the innocent, and I was always the...
I hated that. Yeah. I was the guy that was out of that whole... I sat outside of it as I continued to.
But just in general, that, when you look at,
chimpanzee troops.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to be part of the... Or the 1-month-old baby, desperately looking at you, to pay attention to me. We're a gregarious species. We came from the chimps, so we're a gregarious species, and we are gregarious. And we need to feel like we matter in some way. And so one of the things that is, at first, when I finally came out as an atheist, it was so much fun to be part of, to be able to say it out loud.
You're a good liberal, too, if you're an atheist. Yeah. You're a good progressive liberal.
And, so it was just wonderful to be able to say it, and I don't believe in God. But I realized that most of the people who are Leaders of this movement, they never doubted that they mattered a moment in their lives. They are intellectual leaders. They are respected. They have fanboys galore, right? I mean, they don't...
Religious leaders?
No, the leaders of sort of the new atheist movement. And I'm not criticizing them, but we have to understand...
There's so much ego wrapped up there, too.
Most people don't have this way of feeling how important they are in this world. And if we deprive them of religion, we've got to provide something else.
Dr. Goldstein, I cannot thank you enough for this conversation. I want to say, I think this conversation with you is going to be the first one that set the questions or set the table for a series of conversations that I want to have with people on the show where we discuss this particular issue, because I think this idea of mattering and what matters is of the essence. I think that the extent to which our conceptions of our place in the world have been shattered, have dissolved over time, I think is something that we're not aware of. I mean, even talking to you, this idea of exclusion versus inclusion, I didn't appreciate it as much. And maybe that's because my life is a lot easier than most people's lives.
Yeah.
I'm not part of that excluded sort of group.
Yeah.
And even though I've never been really a churchgoer or never really was taken into that community and have been sort of a child of immigrants and moved around my whole life, and I was always, in some sense, feeling excluded, I still am able to feel an inclusion in the larger society.
Yeah.
This idea is just, to me, is just as powerful.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, your voice is heard. Yeah, you're living a life of mattering. You are, but it's because, I mean, you have talent, and a lot of people don't. And what, do they matter less? Of course they don't. You know, of all the kinds of biases that we've named, you know, racism and sexism and classism, I think talentism is a bias. You matter more if you have talent. Why? No. I mean, every human matters. And I don't say that I'm not guilty of it myself. I admire, you know, the talented very, very much. But I don't say that they ought not to be admired, but it doesn't make them matter more. Not in that ethical sense, in that sense that everybody has a right to feel. If there's one thing I believe, it's that.
Ego, too, plays such a negative role in our society.
Yeah.
Makes it difficult to get to the place that we need to do to accept people who might, under the rubric of an ego, matter less.
That's right.
Right?
That's right, yeah. It's something we humans do. And the only way that we can make it better is to look at it, study it, acknowledge it, take it seriously, change it.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, it's my pleasure.
And that was my episode with Rebecca Goldstein. I want to thank Dr. Goldstein for being on my program. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Edge Studio in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you're a regular listener to the show, take a moment to review us on Apple Podcasts. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.